The crystal chandelier above our dining table had never looked so fragile. Its 1,000 tiny pieces caught the light from the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across faces I thought I knew, but was suddenly seeing for the first time. My stepfather Marcus was gripping his brandy snifter so tightly I thought it might shatter, his knuckles white against the amber liquid. My mother sat frozen in her velvet armchair, her perfectly manicured fingers pressed against her lips as if trying to hold back words that could never be taken back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But it was my half-brother Trevor who broke first. His phone clattered onto the mahogany table, the screen still glowing with the breaking news alert that had just changed everything. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I could feel the weight of 32 years of dismissal, of being treated like the unwanted stepchild who never quite measured up, finally cracking under the pressure of what they were seeing on every news channel in America. "Excuse me, ma'am," came the voice from our front door, calm and professional. "We're with the United States Secret Service. The president would like to speak with Miss Valentina Chen immediately." 3 hours earlier, I had been standing in that same dining room, watching my family prepare for what they called their annual Christmas tradition, but what I had always experienced as an elaborate performance of hierarchy. My mother, Diane, was arranging white orchids in a crystal vase, her movements precise and deliberate, each petal positioned to create the perfect tableau for the family photographs that would later grace their social media accounts. Marcus, my stepfather of 28 years, was holding court in his leather wingback chair, regaling my half-brother Trevor with stories of their latest real estate acquisition. Trevor, golden-haired and silver-tongued, nodded along with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had been groomed since birth to inherit not just money, but an entire worldview where success was measured in square footage and stock portfolios. I had arrived exactly on time, as always, carrying the obligatory bottle of wine that would sit unopened because Marcus preferred his own collection, and wearing the conservative black dress that my mother had once described as appropriate for someone in your position. That phrase had haunted me for years, someone in your position, as if my position in this family had been predetermined, carved in stone, unalterable. The truth was, I had stopped trying to alter it long ago. I had learned to be the ghost at their feast, present but not participating, seen but not heard, acknowledged but never truly accepted. For 3 decades, I had been the consolation prize daughter, the reminder of my mother's first marriage, the living evidence of a chapter in her life she preferred to keep closed. My mother had married my father when she was 19, fresh out of college and full of romantic notions about love conquering all. David Chen had been everything Marcus was not: artistic, passionate, idealistic. He was a photographer who believed in capturing truth rather than creating image, who valued authenticity over appearance. Their marriage had lasted exactly 4 years, ending when I was 2 years old, leaving behind only fragmented memories, and a daughter who would spend the rest of her life trying to prove she belonged somewhere. When my mother remarried Marcus 2 years later, she didn't just gain a wealthy husband and a beautiful home in the hills of Westchester County. She gained a new identity, a reinvention of herself as the perfect socialite wife. Trevor was born a year into their marriage, and with his arrival, the hierarchy of our family was established with mathematical precision. Trevor was the heir, the continuation of Marcus's legacy. I was the artifact from another life, tolerated but never truly embraced. The pattern had been established early and reinforced consistently. Trevor's finger paintings were framed and displayed on the refrigerator. Mine were praised politely and then quietly discarded. Trevor's school plays required the attendance of both parents and a professional photographer. My academic achievements were acknowledged with a brief nod and a reminder not to let my studies interfere with family obligations. When Trevor graduated high school, Marcus threw him a party at the country club with over 200 guests. When I graduated summa cum laude from Columbia with a double major in international relations and computer science, I received a dinner at a local restaurant with just the four of us, where the conversation centered around Trevor's summer internship at Marcus's real estate firm. The psychological architecture of our family was built on these small, seemingly insignificant moments. Each dismissal, each overlooked achievement, each comparison that favored Trevor was like a brick in a wall that grew higher and more impenetrable with each passing year. By the time I was in my 20s, I had learned to exist in the spaces they left for me, to make myself small enough to fit into their carefully constructed narrative. But what they never understood, what they never bothered to discover, was that I had been building something else entirely in those spaces they ignored. While they were focused on Trevor's obvious successes, his networking events and business school applications, I had been quietly constructing a different kind of life altogether. The irony was that my mother and Marcus's dismissal of my achievements had actually created the perfect cover for what I was really doing. When I told them I had gotten a job with a consulting firm in Washington, D.C., they nodded politely and changed the subject to Trevor's latest promotion. When I mentioned working on government contracts, they assumed I was pushing papers in some bureaucratic backwater, the kind of forgettable work that people like them didn't need to understand. They never asked for details because they had already decided my life wasn't interesting enough to warrant their attention. They never wondered why I couldn't discuss specifics of my work because they had already categorized me as someone who did unimportant things. Their indifference became my invisibility cloak, allowing me to disappear into a world they couldn't even imagine existed. That world was the intersection of cybersecurity and national intelligence, where the battles for America's future were fought not with guns and bombs, but with algorithms and encryption keys. While my family saw me as their quiet, unremarkable daughter who worked with computers, I was actually part of an elite team of digital warriors who spent their days and nights protecting the country's most sensitive information systems from threats they would never read about in the newspaper. My official title was Senior Cybersecurity Analyst for the Department of Homeland Security, but that bland government designation covered a reality that was far more complex and dangerous. I was part of a specialized unit called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Division, and our job was to anticipate, identify, and neutralize cyber threats to the nation's most vital systems before they could cause catastrophic damage. Most people think of cybersecurity in terms of protecting their personal information or their company's data, but the work I did operated on a completely different level. We were the guardians of the digital nervous system that kept American civilization functioning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The power grids that lit cities, the financial networks that processed trillions of dollars in transactions, the communication systems that connected emergency services, the transportation networks that moved people and goods across the continent. Every day, hostile actors from around the world launched thousands of sophisticated attacks against these systems. Some were criminal enterprises looking for financial gain. Others were terrorist organizations seeking to cause chaos and fear. But the most dangerous were the state-sponsored groups, the cyber armies of foreign governments, who viewed the digital infrastructure of the United States as a battlefield in an undeclared war. My specialty was pattern recognition and threat assessment. I could look at seemingly random network anomalies and data flows and see the hidden signatures of coordinated attacks. I could identify the digital fingerprints that revealed which hostile actors were behind specific intrusions. I could predict how an attack would evolve and what systems would be targeted next, often hours or days before the attackers themselves had made those decisions. It was work that required not just technical expertise, but a kind of intuitive understanding of human psychology and geopolitical strategy. I had to think like the attackers, to understand their motivations and objectives, to anticipate their next moves in a chess game where the stakes were nothing less than national security. The secrecy requirements were absolute. I held a top-secret clearance with special compartmented information access, which meant that discussing any aspect of my work with unauthorized individuals was not just a firing offense, but a federal crime. I had signed documents that made it clear I could face decades in prison for revealing classified information, even to my own family. So, when my mother and Marcus asked their polite, disinterested questions about my work, I gave them the sanitized answers I had been trained to provide. Yes, I worked with computer security. No, nothing too exciting, mostly routine maintenance and updates. Yes, I was doing well, thank you for asking. Now, could we please talk about something else? They were happy to talk about something else because my work didn't fit into their framework of success and achievement. They understood Trevor's real estate deals and business acquisitions because those were tangible, visible, measurable. They could see the properties he developed, count the profits he generated, celebrate the recognition he received from industry publications and professional associations. My work, by contrast, was invisible by design. When I succeeded, nothing happened. Systems continued to function normally, citizens went about their daily lives, unaware that they had been protected from threats they would never know existed. There were no newspaper headlines celebrating successful cyber defense operations, no public ceremonies honoring the analysts who had prevented digital catastrophes, no tangible metrics that could be displayed on a wall or discussed at dinner parties. The most successful cybersecurity professionals were the ones whose names were never known, whose achievements could never be publicly acknowledged, whose contributions to national security would remain classified for decades. We measured our success not by what we accomplished, but by what we prevented, not by the recognition we received, but by the disasters that never occurred. This invisible nature of my work made it easy for my family to dismiss it as unimportant. They couldn't see the late nights I spent tracking suspicious network traffic from foreign IP addresses. They couldn't witness the adrenaline-fueled moments when I identified an active intrusion and worked with response teams to neutralize it before critical systems could be compromised. They couldn't understand the weight of responsibility I carried, knowing that a mistake or oversight on my part could have consequences that rippled through millions of lives. Instead, they saw a daughter who worked regular hours at a government job, who didn't bring home exciting stories or impressive business cards, who couldn't explain what she did in terms they could easily understand or brag about to their friends. In their world of visible success and tangible achievements, I had become functionally invisible. The psychological toll of this dual existence was something I had learned to manage but never overcome. There was a constant cognitive dissonance between the person I was at work and the person I was expected to be at home. At the office, I was respected for my expertise, consulted on critical decisions, trusted with information that could affect national policy. At family gatherings, I was the quiet one in the corner, the daughter who had chosen the safe, boring path, the one who would never quite measure up to her more successful half-brother. Over the years, I had developed coping strategies that allowed me to navigate these two worlds without losing my sanity entirely. I learned to compartmentalize, to switch between my professional identity and my family role as easily as changing clothes. I learned to find validation in my work rather than seeking it from my family. I learned to measure my worth by my contributions to something larger than myself, rather than by the approval or disapproval of people who would never understand what I had accomplished. But there were moments when the weight of the secret became almost unbearable. Times when I wanted to tell them about the cyber attack on the financial sector that I helped prevent, saving millions of Americans from having their retirement accounts wiped out. Times when I wanted to explain that the reason their electricity had stayed on during a particularly severe storm was because our team had protected the power grid from a coordinated attack designed to exploit the chaos of natural disaster. Instead, I would sit at their dinner table and listen to Trevor describe his latest real estate project, watch Marcus beam with pride as he detailed the profit margins and market projections, feel my mother's gentle but persistent disappointment that I hadn't chosen a more conventional path to success. And I would smile and nod and play my role as the underachieving daughter who had settled for mediocrity while her family reached for greatness. The holidays were always the worst. Christmas, in particular, had become an annual reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. The gift exchange was a carefully choreographed demonstration of who mattered and who didn't. Trevor received expensive watches, luxury vacations, down payments on investment properties. I received practical gifts, a new laptop for work, a gift certificate to a clothing store, a cookbook I would never use. The disparity wasn't just about money, though. Marcus certainly had plenty of that. It was about attention, interest, investment in the future. Trevor's gifts came with long conversations about his plans and dreams, discussions of strategy and opportunity, expressions of confidence in his ability to succeed. My gifts came with polite thanks and quickly diverted attention back to more important matters. This Christmas was shaping up to be no different. I had arrived at the family home in Westchester expecting the usual pageantry of dysfunction, the familiar dance of polite conversation and barely concealed indifference. I had braced myself for another evening of being the supporting actress in the ongoing drama of Trevor's success story. What I hadn't expected was that this particular Christmas would be the night when my two worlds would collide with the force of a nuclear explosion. I hadn't anticipated that the work I had been doing in secret, the threats I had been tracking in silence, the investigation I had been pursuing in the digital shadows, would suddenly burst into the realm of primetime television and emergency presidential briefings. But as I stood in that dining room, watching my mother fuss over her perfect table setting, while Marcus and Trevor discussed their business empire, I had no idea that 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., the most sophisticated cyber attack in American history was about to be publicly revealed, and that my name was at the very center of both the attack and the investigation that had exposed it. I had no idea that within hours, the family that had spent 32 years treating me as an afterthought would discover that their quiet, unremarkable daughter had been living a double life that made their wildest ambitions look like child's play. I had no idea that the Secret Service agents already en route to our house were carrying orders that would change everything, not just for me, but for the carefully constructed mythology of success and importance that had governed our family for as long as I could remember. All I knew was that I was tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that their approval mattered, tired of making myself smaller so they could feel bigger. What I didn't know was that I was about to become the most visible person in America, and that visibility would finally, irrevocably, shatter the illusion that had defined our family for 3 decades. The crystal chandelier continued to cast its dancing shadows across the dining room, and in those patterns of light and darkness, I could almost see the ghost of the family we might have been if they had ever bothered to look closely enough to see who I really was. But it was too late for that now. The truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not, and I was finally going to discover what it felt like to step out of the shadows and into the light. The first sign that something was wrong came at exactly 4:47 p.m. on Christmas Day, when my secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made my blood run cold. I was in the guest bathroom of my family's home, the only place I could check classified communications without raising questions, when the alert appeared on my screen. It was from Director Sarah Martinez, my supervisor at the Department of Homeland Security, and it contained just 4 words that I knew would change everything. Operation Blackwater is live. Operation Blackwater was the code name for the investigation I had been leading for the past 18 months, tracking what appeared to be the most sophisticated state-sponsored cyber espionage campaign in American history. What had started as routine anomaly detection in federal network traffic had evolved into the discovery of a massive, coordinated infiltration of critical infrastructure systems across the entire country. The attack wasn't designed to cause immediate damage or disruption. Instead, it was far more insidious, a patient, methodical insertion of advanced persistent threats into the control systems that managed everything from regional power grids to water treatment facilities to transportation networks. The attackers had spent years building backdoors and establishing command structures that would allow them to cause coordinated, catastrophic failures across multiple sectors simultaneously. But even more disturbing was what we had discovered about the source of the attack. The digital forensics had led us through a complex web of proxy servers, compromised systems, and false flag operations that initially pointed to several different nation-state actors. The attack signatures seemed to shift and evolve, suggesting either unprecedented cooperation between hostile governments or a level of sophistication that exceeded anything we had seen before. It had taken me 8 months of painstaking analysis to realize that we weren't dealing with a foreign government at all. The attack was coming from inside the United States, orchestrated by a domestic terrorist organization with resources and technical capabilities that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies. They called themselves the Digital Liberation Front, and their objective wasn't just to damage American infrastructure, but to trigger a complete collapse of the systems that modern society depended on. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago when I identified a pattern in the timing of the various infiltration attempts that corresponded with specific political events and legislative sessions. The attacks weren't random or opportunistic, they were carefully timed to maximize psychological and economic impact. The terrorists weren't just trying to cause chaos, they were trying to undermine public confidence in the government's ability to protect its citizens. What made the situation even more dangerous was that the Digital Liberation Front had recruited insiders from within the cybersecurity community itself. Several of the compromised systems had been breached using legitimate administrative credentials belonging to trusted security professionals who had been either corrupted or coerced into cooperation. The attackers knew our defensive strategies, our response protocols, our organizational structures. They had been planning this operation for years, and they had insider knowledge that made traditional defensive measures nearly useless. The investigation had consumed my life for the better part of 2 years. I had worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, tracking digital breadcrumbs across dozens of networks and systems. I had coordinated with FBI cybercrime units, NSA analysts, and private sector security firms to build a comprehensive picture of the threat. I had briefed senior officials at the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, and eventually the president himself on the scope and implications of what we were facing. The decision to go public with Operation Blackwater had been made at the highest levels of government after weeks of debate and planning. The terrorist organization was apparently preparing to activate their embedded malware in coordination with a major holiday when emergency response capabilities would be limited and public attention would be focused elsewhere. Intelligence suggested that Christmas Day had been selected as the optimal time for their attack. The plan was to preempt their operation by simultaneously arresting key members of the Digital Liberation Front, securing the compromised systems, and publicly revealing the extent of the threat in order to prevent panic and misinformation. The operation required precise coordination between multiple agencies and had been planned with the kind of operational security typically reserved for military actions in hostile territory. My role in Operation Blackwater was supposed to remain classified indefinitely. I was the lead analyst who had identified the threat and tracked its evolution, but the public face of the investigation would be senior officials whose identities were already known and whose security clearances allowed them to speak publicly about classified matters. I was supposed to remain in the shadows, credited internally but invisible to the outside world. That plan had apparently changed sometime between my last briefing 3 days ago and this moment in my family's bathroom, staring at an encrypted message that told me my name was about to become public knowledge in connection with what would soon be headline news across every media outlet in the country. I typed a quick response requesting more information, but before I could send it, another message appeared from Director Martinez. Presidential address at 8 p.m. Your name will be mentioned. Media briefing follows. Suggest you inform family immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow. In less than 3 hours, the President of the United States was going to address the nation about a cyber terrorism threat that had been prevented through an investigation I had led. My name, which had been protected by classification levels that most Americans didn't even know existed, was about to be broadcast to hundreds of millions of people. I sat down heavily on the closed toilet seat, trying to process the implications. My family was downstairs, preparing for their annual Christmas dinner, completely unaware that their disappointing daughter, who worked a boring government job, was about to be identified as the person who had prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. The irony was overwhelming. For 32 years, I had been the invisible member of this family, the one whose achievements didn't matter, whose career wasn't worth discussing, whose contributions to the world were so insignificant that they barely merited acknowledgement. In 3 hours, they were going to discover that while they had been dismissing me as a failure, I had been literally protecting the country they lived in from threats they couldn't even imagine. All I knew was that I was tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that their approval mattered, tired of making myself smaller so they could feel bigger. What I didn't know was that I was about to become the most visible person in America, and that visibility would finally, irrevocably, shatter the illusion that had defined our family for 3 decades. The crystal chandelier continued to cast its dancing shadows across the dining room, and in those patterns of light and darkness, I could almost see the ghost of the family we might have been if they had ever bothered to look closely enough to see who I really was. But it was too late for that now. The truth was coming whether they were ready for it or not, and I was finally going to discover what it felt like to step out of the shadows and into the light. The first sign that something was wrong came at exactly 4:47 p.m. on Christmas Day when my secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made my blood run cold. I was in the guest bathroom of my family's home, the only place I could check classified communications without raising questions, when the alert appeared on my screen. It was from Director Sarah Martinez, my supervisor at the Department of Homeland Security, and it contained just 4 words that I knew would change everything. Operation Blackwater is live. Operation Blackwater was the code name for the investigation I had been leading for the past 18 months, tracking what appeared to be the most sophisticated state-sponsored cyber espionage campaign in American history. What had started I tried to imagine how I would explain this to them. How do you tell your family that you've been lying to them for years about what you do for a living? How do you reveal that the quiet, unambitious daughter they've been patronizing is actually one of the most important cybersecurity analysts in the federal government? How do you bridge the gap between the person they think you are and the person you actually are, when that gap is measured in security clearances and classified operations? But even more challenging was the question of whether it mattered anymore. I had spent so many years seeking their approval, wanting their recognition, hoping they would finally see value in what I was doing. Now that recognition was about to be forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control, and I found myself wondering if their inevitable shock and attempts at reconciliation would mean anything at all. My phone buzzed again with another encrypted message, this one containing preliminary talking points that the president would be using in his address. I scanned through the document, seeing my name mentioned multiple times in connection with phrases like exceptional analytical capabilities, prevented catastrophic infrastructure damage, and exemplary service to the nation. The language was formal and official, but the meaning was clear. I was about to be publicly recognized for achievements that dwarfed anything my family had ever imagined I was capable of. The talking points also included background information that would be released to the media after the president's address. My educational background, my career progression, my role in previous cybersecurity initiatives that had been declassified for this announcement. The document painted a picture of someone who had been working at the highest levels of national security for years, someone whose expertise was sought by senior government officials and whose analysis had influenced major policy decisions. Reading about my own career in this clinical, official language felt surreal. The achievements that had been invisible to my family for so long were now being documented and prepared for public consumption. Awards and commendations that I had received but could never discuss were about to be part of a media briefing that would be carried by every news network in the country. I realized that I needed to prepare for what was coming, both professionally and personally. In a few hours, I would go from being a completely unknown government analyst to being one of the most recognizable faces in American cybersecurity. My phone would start ringing with interview requests, my email would be flooded with messages from reporters and colleagues, my life would be turned upside down by the kind of public attention I had never wanted and never prepared for. But first, I had to survive Christmas dinner with my family. I had to sit at their table and listen to their usual conversations about real estate and business ventures, knowing that everything they thought they knew about our relative positions in the world was about to be revealed as completely wrong. I had to maintain the facade of being their disappointing daughter for just a few more hours before that facade would be permanently shattered by forces beyond any of our control. I splashed some cold water on my face and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The person looking back at me was about to become famous for reasons that my family couldn't comprehend. In a few hours, strangers across the country would know more about my professional achievements than the people who raised me. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. I straightened my shoulders and prepared to rejoin the family gathering downstairs. There was no point in trying to prepare them for what was coming because there were no words that could bridge the gap between their perception of me and the reality that was about to be revealed. Instead, I would let them discover the truth the same way the rest of America would, by watching the President of the United States explain how their boring, unambitious daughter had helped save the country from catastrophic cyber terrorism. The dining room looked exactly the same when I returned, but everything felt different. Marcus was still holding court from his leather chair, regaling Trevor with stories of their latest property acquisition. My mother was still arranging and rearranging the place settings, ensuring that every detail met her exacting standards for the perfect holiday meal. Trevor was still nodding enthusiastically at his stepfather's business wisdom, playing the role of the attentive heir apparent. None of them looked up when I entered the room. I was still invisible to them, still the background character in their ongoing drama of success and achievement. But I knew that invisibility had an expiration date that was rapidly approaching, and when it ended, nothing would ever be the same. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the position that had been assigned to me through years of subtle but consistent marginalization. From here, I could observe the family dynamics that had shaped my entire life, the careful choreography of inclusion and exclusion that had taught me my place in their hierarchy. But tonight, I was observing these patterns with the knowledge that they were about to be permanently disrupted. Marcus was in the middle of explaining to Trevor the importance of maintaining strong relationships with local zoning officials when the conversation turned to the subject that I had been dreading. My mother, perhaps feeling some maternal obligation to include me in the family discussion, looked in my direction with the polite smile she reserved for uncomfortable social situations. "Valentina, dear," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced interest that I had learned to recognize over the years. "How are things at your office? Still working on those computer projects?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 32 years, I had answered variations of this question with vague, non-committal responses designed to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything substantial about what I actually did. I had perfected the art of discussing my work in terms so general and boring that they would quickly lose interest and move on to more engaging topics. But tonight, sitting at this table with the knowledge that in less than 2 hours the president would be discussing my work on national television, the familiar evasions felt impossible to maintain. I could feel the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on me, the accumulated frustration of being dismissed and overlooked by people who had never bothered to learn who I really was. "Things are busy," I said, choosing my words carefully. "We've been working on some significant projects lately. Cybersecurity challenges that affect critical infrastructure." Trevor looked up from his conversation with Marcus, his expression showing the mild interest he might display toward a moderately amusing news story. "Critical infrastructure? That sounds important. Are we talking about, like, power plants and stuff?" I nodded, feeling a strange sense of anticipation as I prepared to offer them a glimpse of the reality they had been ignoring. Among other things, the power grid, water systems, transportation networks, financial institutions, all the systems that modern society depend on to function. Marcus set down his brandy snifter and looked at me with the kind of patronizing attention he might give to a child explaining their finger painting. "Well, that certainly sounds like important work, Valentina. Very responsible of you to help keep those systems running smoothly." The condescension in his tone was as familiar as it was infuriating. He was treating me like a maintenance worker whose job was to keep the machinery running, completely unaware that I was actually one of the people responsible for protecting those systems from threats that could cripple the entire country. "It's more than just keeping things running," I said, feeling a dangerous urge to push back against their assumptions. "We identify and neutralize threats from hostile actors who want to cause damage or disruption. State-sponsored cyber attacks, terrorist organizations, criminal enterprises that target civilian infrastructure." My mother's eyebrows rose slightly, as if she was surprised to hear me speak with such apparent authority about subjects that sounded so dramatic and important. "That sounds quite serious, dear. Are these the kind of threats we read about in the newspaper?" Most of what we deal with never makes it to the newspapers, I replied, walking a careful line between honesty and operational security. The most successful cybersecurity work is invisible. When we do our jobs well, nothing happens. Systems continue to function normally, and people go about their daily lives without ever knowing they were in danger. Trevor leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from mild interest to something approaching skepticism. So you're like fighting cyber terrorists or something? That seems pretty intense for a government job. The phrase government job carried all the dismissive weight that my family had always attached to my career. In their minds, government work was synonymous with bureaucracy, inefficiency, and mediocrity. They couldn't conceive of government service as anything other than a fallback option for people who weren't ambitious or talented enough to succeed in the private sector. Something like that, I said, deciding that there was no point in trying to explain the reality of my work to people who had already decided it wasn't worth understanding. It's specialized work that requires specific training and security clearances. Marcus nodded sagely, as if he was absorbing profound wisdom about the complexities of public service. Well, we certainly appreciate people like you who are willing to do that kind of work. It may not be glamorous, but it's necessary for society to function properly. The casual dismissal embedded in his praise was perfectly calibrated to acknowledge my work while simultaneously diminishing its importance. He was positioning himself as the magnanimous patriarch who recognized the value of humble public service while making it clear that such service occupied a much lower tier in his hierarchy of achievement than the real estate empire he and Trevor were building. I looked around the table at these people who had shaped my entire life through their consistent failure to see me clearly. My mother, who had chosen to remarry into wealth and status rather than maintain connection with the daughter who reminded her of a more complicated time in her life. Marcus, who had never accepted me as a real member of his family, but had tolerated my presence as part of the package deal that came with marrying my mother. Trevor, who had been raised to see himself as the natural center of attention and had never questioned why his half-sister seemed so unremarkable by comparison. They were all intelligent people in their own ways, successful within their chosen spheres, capable of understanding complex concepts when those concepts related to subjects they cared about. But they had collectively chosen to remain willfully ignorant about the most important aspects of my life, because those aspects didn't fit into the narrative they had constructed about who I was supposed to be. The conversation moved on to other topics, as it always did when my work came up. Trevor began describing a new commercial development project he was managing, and Marcus offered detailed commentary on market conditions and financing strategies. My mother listened with the kind of engaged attention she had never shown when I tried to explain anything about my career. I sat in my familiar position at the periphery of their discussion, but for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't feeling the usual mixture of frustration and resignation. Instead, I was experiencing something closer to anticipation. In less than an hour, these people who had spent decades dismissing my achievements were going to discover that their understanding of success and importance had been fundamentally flawed. The President of the United States was going to interrupt their evening to talk about work that I had done. Cable news networks were going to spend hours analyzing an investigation that I had led. Security experts and government officials were going to be asked to comment on analysis and recommendations that bore my name. But more than that, they were going to realize that while they had been treating me as the family disappointment, I had been operating at levels of responsibility and authority that made their business achievements look trivial by comparison. They were going to understand that the daughter they had overlooked was actually more successful, more important, and more accomplished than they had ever imagined possible. The clock on the mantel showed 7:30 p.m. In 30 minutes, everything would change. The family hierarchy that had governed our relationships for 3 decades was about to be permanently inverted, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. I excused myself from the table and walked to the large windows that overlooked the front of the property. The circular driveway was empty, except for the usual collection of luxury vehicles that represented the visible symbols of my family's prosperity. But I knew that sometime in the next few hours, that driveway would be occupied by government vehicles carrying federal agents whose presence would transform this private family gathering into something altogether different. My phone buzzed with another encrypted message from Director Martinez. Secret Service en route to your location. ETA 20 minutes. Presidential briefing will include request for your immediate consultation. Suggest you prepare family for unusual evening. I stared at the message, trying to process what it meant. The Secret Service was coming here, to my family's home, to escort me to a consultation with the president. The boring government employee who worked on computer problems was about to be personally summoned by the most powerful person in the world to discuss matters of national security. The magnitude of what was about to happen finally hit me with full force. This wasn't just going to be a news story that mentioned my name in passing. This was going to be a complete transformation of my public identity, a revelation that would change not just how my family saw me, but how I saw myself. For years, I had lived with the cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously important and invisible, respected in my professional life, but dismissed in my personal relationships. That contradiction was about to be resolved in the most dramatic way possible, and I had no idea how to prepare for the psychological impact of such a sudden and complete reversal. I looked back at my family, still engaged in their comfortable conversation about familiar subjects, completely unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. In a few minutes, everything they thought they knew about success, about achievement, about the relative importance of different kinds of work was going to be challenged by a reality they had never bothered to investigate. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I had waited 32 years for this moment of recognition, even though I had never imagined it would come in such a dramatic and public way. All the years of being overlooked, all the achievements that had gone unacknowledged, all the respect I had earned from colleagues they would never meet was about to be validated in the most spectacular fashion possible. But underneath the anticipation was something else, a profound sadness that it had taken a presidential address and a national security crisis to make my own family pay attention to who I actually was. The recognition that was coming felt hollow because it was being forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control, not chosen because they had finally decided I was worth knowing. The sound of vehicles in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I could see two black SUVs with government plates pulling up to the front of the house. Men and women in dark suits were getting out of the vehicles, moving with the controlled purpose that I recognized from my work environment. My family's conversation stopped abruptly as they noticed the activity outside. Marcus stood up from his chair and moved toward the window, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in the obvious signs of an official presence. "What's all this about?" he asked, looking at me as if I might somehow be responsible for the disruption of his perfect Christmas evening. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang with the kind of authoritative tone that suggested the people outside were not going to wait patiently for someone to answer at their convenience. My mother looked at Marcus with the kind of panic that accompanies unexpected visits from law enforcement, while Trevor pulled out his phone and began frantically searching for news stories that might explain why federal agents were at their front door. I took a deep breath and prepared to watch my family's comfortable world collide with the reality I had been living in secret for years. The moment of recognition I had been waiting for was finally here, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus opened the front door with the kind of forced composure that wealthy people use when confronted with situations beyond their control. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray eyes and an air of absolute authority, stepped forward and displayed her credentials with practiced efficiency. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. I'm Special Agent Patricia Hawkins with the United States Secret Service. We need to speak with Miss Valentina Chen immediately regarding a matter of national security." The words hung in the air like a detonation. I watched my stepfather's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching terror as he processed what he was hearing. Behind him, my mother had gone pale, her hand pressed against her throat in a gesture of shock that would have been theatrical if it weren't so genuine. "National security?" Marcus repeated, his voice cracking slightly on the words. I think there must be some mistake. Valentina works for the government, but she's just a computer analyst or something. There's nothing about her job that would involve national security. Agent Hawkins looked past him into the house, her eyes finding me where I stood near the window. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of classified information that was about to become very public. Miss Chen is the senior cybersecurity analyst who led the investigation into Operation Blackwater, the most significant cyber terrorism threat in American history. The President of the United States has requested her immediate presence for a consultation regarding the ongoing response to this threat. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Trevor's mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process what he was hearing. My mother's carefully composed dinner party demeanor had completely collapsed, replaced by the raw shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions of reality had just been shattered. Marcus stepped back from the door, his usual commanding presence reduced to bewildered confusion. I don't understand. Valentina never said anything about terrorism or working with the president. She said she did routine computer maintenance for some government agency. Agent Hawkins entered the house, followed by 3 other agents who immediately began establishing a secure perimeter around the dining room. Their presence transformed the elegant space into something resembling a command center, with agents positioning themselves at strategic points while one began setting up communication equipment. Miss Chen's work has been classified at the highest levels of government security, Agent Hawkins explained, her tone professionally neutral but unmistakably serious. The nature of her responsibilities and achievements could not be disclosed until the president made the decision to declassify certain aspects of Operation Blackwater for his address to the nation tonight. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Trevor's mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process what he was hearing. My mother's carefully composed dinner party demeanor had completely collapsed, replaced by the raw shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions of reality had just been shattered. Marcus stepped back from the door, his usual commanding presence reduced to bewildered confusion. I don't understand. Valentina never said anything about terrorism or working with the president. She said she did routine computer maintenance for some government agency. Agent Hawkins entered the house, followed by 3 other agents who immediately began establishing a secure perimeter around the dining room. Their presence transformed the elegant space into something resembling a command center, with agents positioning themselves at strategic points while one began setting up communication equipment. Miss Chen's work has been classified at the highest levels of government security, Agent Hawkins explained, her tone professionally neutral but unmistakably serious. The nature of her responsibilities and achievements could not be disclosed until the president made the decision to declassify certain aspects of Operation Blackwater for his address to the nation tonight. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Trevor's mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process what he was hearing. My mother's carefully composed dinner party demeanor had completely collapsed, replaced by the raw shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions of reality had just been shattered. Marcus stepped back from the door, his usual commanding presence reduced to bewildered confusion. I don't understand. Valentina never said anything about terrorism or working with the president. She said she did routine computer maintenance for some government agency. Agent Hawkins entered the house, followed by 3 other agents who immediately began establishing a secure perimeter around the dining room. Their presence transformed the elegant space into something resembling a command center, with agents positioning themselves at strategic points while one began setting up communication equipment. Miss Chen's work has been classified at the highest levels of government security, Agent Hawkins explained, her tone professionally neutral but unmistakably serious. The nature of her responsibilities and achievements could not be disclosed until the president made the decision to declassify certain aspects of Operation Blackwater for his address to the nation tonight. Trevor finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Address to the nation? The president is going to talk about Valentina? As if summoned by his question, every television screen in the house simultaneously switched to the presidential seal, accompanied by the familiar musical fanfare that announces an address from the Oval Office. The timing was perfect, orchestrated with the precision that only comes from the highest levels of government coordination. My family stood frozen in their dining room, surrounded by Secret Service agents as the President of the United States appeared on their television screen. When he began to speak, his words demolished 32 years of their carefully constructed understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. My fellow Americans, tonight I want to speak to you about a threat to our nation that was discovered, investigated, and neutralized by some of the most dedicated professionals in our government. 3 weeks ago, we learned that a domestic terrorist organization calling itself the Digital Liberation Front had spent years infiltrating the computer systems that control our most critical infrastructure. The president's voice filled the room as my family listened with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for natural disasters or national emergencies. On the screen behind him, graphics illustrated the scope of the threat that had been detected. Power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, financial systems, all compromised by sophisticated malware designed to cause coordinated, catastrophic failures. The investigation that uncovered this plot was led by senior cybersecurity analyst Valentina Chen of the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Chen's exceptional analytical capabilities and tireless dedication to protecting our nation identified patterns and connections that other investigators had missed. Her work prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. I watched my mother sink into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The president was describing achievements and responsibilities that were so far beyond their conception of my capabilities that they seemed to be talking about a completely different person. Over the past 18 months, Ms. Chen has worked closely with the FBI, the NSA, and other intelligence agencies to map the full extent of this cyber infiltration. Her analysis revealed that the terrorists had recruited insiders from within the cybersecurity community itself, making this threat even more dangerous and difficult to detect. Trevor was staring at the television screen with the same expression he might have if it had announced that aliens had landed on the White House lawn. The cognitive dissonance between the person the president was describing and the quiet, disappointing half-sister he had known his entire life was so complete that he seemed unable to process what he was hearing. The complexity and sophistication of this attack required a response at the very highest levels of government. Ms. Chen has briefed the National Security Council, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and myself personally on multiple occasions. Her recommendations have shaped our cybersecurity policy and our response to emerging threats in the digital domain. Marcus had moved to sit heavily in his leather chair, his face ashen as he listened to the president describe a level of professional achievement that dwarfed everything he had accomplished in his decades of business success. The man who had spent years lecturing me about the importance of building something tangible was learning that I had been protecting the tangible infrastructure that his entire lifestyle depended on. Tonight, thanks to Ms. Chen's work and the coordinated efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies, we have arrested the key members of the Digital Liberation Front and secured the compromised systems they had infiltrated. The threat has been neutralized, and the American people can be confident that their critical infrastructure remains secure. The president continued his address, providing additional details about the investigation and the arrests that had taken place earlier that day. But my family was no longer listening to the specific information. They were struggling to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person being described by the most powerful individual in the world. When the address concluded, Agent Hawkins approached me with the professional courtesy reserved for senior government officials. Ms. Chen, the president has requested your immediate presence at the White House for a debriefing on the operational outcomes. We have a helicopter standing by to transport you to Washington. The words helicopter standing by seemed to break through my family's shocked paralysis. My mother looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of awe, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. "Valentina," she said, her voice barely audible, "is this real? Did you really do all the things the president said you did?" I looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me but had never really known me, and felt a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't easily sort through. There was vindication, certainly, and a satisfaction at seeing their assumptions about my life proved so dramatically wrong. But there was also sadness at the realization that it had taken a presidential address for my own mother to ask me a serious question about my work. "It's real," I said simply. "I've been working on cybersecurity threats like this for years. The classification requirements meant I couldn't discuss any of it with you. But yes, this is what I actually do for a living." Trevor stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "But you never said anything. All those years, you let us think you were just pushing papers in some boring government job. Why didn't you tell us you were doing something so important?" The question hung in the air, loaded with years of unexamined assumptions and missed opportunities. I could have given him a detailed explanation about security clearances and operational secrecy, about the legal and professional obligations that had prevented me from discussing my work. But the real answer was more complicated and more painful than anything involving government regulations. "I tried to tell you," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. "Not the classified details, but the general nature of the work, the importance of what we were protecting, the level of responsibility involved. Every time I brought it up, you changed the subject or made it clear you weren't interested in understanding." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps beginning to remember the many conversations where he had dismissed my work as unimportant, bureaucratic drudgery. "We didn't know. You made it sound like routine computer maintenance." "I made it sound like what I was allowed to make it sound like," I replied. "But more than that, I made it sound like what you were willing to hear. You had already decided that my career wasn't worth your attention, so you never asked the kind of questions that would have helped you understand what I actually did." Agent Hawkins stepped forward diplomatically, her presence a reminder that larger concerns were taking priority over family drama.
Chen, we really do need to depart for Washington as soon as possible. The President's National Security Team is waiting for your assessment of the operational cleanup. I nodded, understanding that my personal reckoning with my family would have to be secondary to my professional responsibilities. But as I prepared to leave with the Secret Service, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic that could never be unchanged. "I need to go," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "This investigation isn't over just because we made arrests. There are systems to secure, protocols to update, preventative measures to implement. The work continues." My mother stood up suddenly, reaching toward me with a gesture that seemed to encompass years of misunderstanding and missed connections. "Valentina, wait. I need to understand. How long have you been doing work at this level? How long have we been completely wrong about what your life was like?" The question was asked with such genuine bewilderment that I felt something shift inside me, a small crack in the wall of resentment I had built up over decades of being overlooked and dismissed. For the first time in my adult life, my mother was asking me about my work because she actually wanted to understand, not because social politeness required her to make conversation. 8 years, I said quietly. I've been working on threats to critical infrastructure for 8 years. The last 3 years, I've been briefing officials at the cabinet level on emerging cybersecurity challenges. For the past 18 months, I've been leading the most important cybersecurity investigation in the history of the Department of Homeland Security. The numbers seemed to hit them with physical force. 8 years of working at the highest levels of national security while they had treated me like the family disappointment. 3 years of briefing cabinet officials while they had patronized me about my modest government job. 18 months of leading a critical national security investigation while they had been planning to write me out of the family inheritance. Trevor sat back down heavily, his face pale as he processed the implications. All those family dinners where Dad would lecture you about building something important for the future. All those times we talked about legacy and achievement while you sat there saying nothing. You were already doing work that was more important than anything we ever imagined. The irony was devastating in its completeness. While Marcus had been giving speeches about the importance of making a tangible impact on the world, I had been literally protecting the infrastructure that made their comfortable lifestyle possible. While they had been measuring success in terms of property acquisitions and profit margins, I had been preventing terrorist attacks that could have killed thousands of people and crippled the national economy. Agent Hawkins checked her watch with the kind of diplomatic impatience that suggested the president's schedule was not flexible. "Miss Chen, the helicopter is waiting. We really do need to depart immediately." I picked up my coat and purse, the same mundane accessories I had brought to countless family gatherings where I had been treated as an afterthought. But now, these simple objects felt different, charged with the significance of a life that had been validated at the highest levels of government. "I'll call you when I can," I told my family, though I wasn't sure when that would be or what we would say to each other when we finally had that conversation. This situation is going to dominate the news cycle for weeks. You'll probably learn more about my work from cable news than you ever learned from me directly. As I walked toward the door, flanked by Secret Service agents who treated me with the deference reserved for senior government officials, I could feel my family watching me with a kind of stunned recognition. The invisible daughter was leaving their house, escorted by federal agents to consult with the President of the United States, and they were finally beginning to understand how completely they had misunderstood who I was. The helicopter ride to Washington gave me time to process what had just happened. Below me, the lights of the metropolitan area stretched out in patterns that I recognized from satellite imagery and network maps, the physical manifestation of the digital infrastructure I had spent years protecting. But for the first time, I was seeing it not just as a professional responsibility, but as a personal vindication. The White House was buzzing with activity when we arrived. The Situation Room was filled with senior officials from multiple agencies, all focused on the ongoing operational response to the terrorist arrests. When I entered the room, conversation stopped and attention turned to me with the kind of respect I had earned, but my family had never witnessed. The president looked up from a briefing document and smiled with genuine warmth. "Valentina, excellent work on this operation. Your analysis made all the difference. We need your assessment of the security implications and your recommendations for preventing similar infiltrations in the future." For the next 4 hours, I worked with the highest levels of government to coordinate the response to a terrorist threat I had discovered and investigated. My expertise was sought, my opinions were valued, and my recommendations were implemented as policy. It was the kind of professional validation that most people only dream of receiving, and it was happening on the same night that my family had finally learned who I really was. When I finally returned home 3 days later, the media attention had transformed my quiet life into something resembling a circus. News trucks lined the street outside my apartment building, reporters called my phone constantly, and my name had become synonymous with cybersecurity expertise in every major publication. But the call that mattered most came from my mother on New Year's Eve. Her voice was different, tentative in a way I had never heard before. "Valentina, I've been reading about your work, trying to understand what you've been doing all these years. I realized that we never really knew you at all."
We never even tried to know you. The admission was stunning in its simplicity and honesty. For 32 years, she had been content to accept a surface-level understanding of my life, to let assumptions and preconceptions substitute for genuine interest and engagement. Now she was confronting the reality that her own daughter had been living a life of significance and achievement that she had been completely oblivious to. "I know," I said, and for the first time in decades, there was no anger in that acknowledgement. "But I also know that I had gotten used to being invisible to you. I had stopped trying to help you understand because it seemed easier to live with your indifference than to keep pushing against it." We talked for 2 hours that night, the longest conversation about my life that we had ever had. She asked about my education, my career progression, the challenges and satisfactions of my work. She wanted to understand not just what I did, but who I had become, the person she had somehow failed to notice despite living in the same family for over 3 decades. Marcus called a few days later with what sounded like a prepared speech about respecting my achievements and acknowledging his mistakes. Trevor sent a long email apologizing for years of dismissive behavior and asking if we could start over as adults who actually knew each other. Their attempts at reconciliation were genuine, but they felt incomplete. The recognition they were offering me now was real, but it had required external validation from the highest levels of government to make them see what had been in front of them all along. I had finally received the acknowledgement I had wanted for so long, but it came with the understanding that their approval had never been based on who I actually was. 6 months later, I was promoted to Deputy Director of Cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland Security, making me one of the youngest people ever to hold such a senior position in the federal government. The promotion ceremony was attended by cabinet officials, senior military officers, and intelligence community leaders who had worked with me on various operations. My family was there too, sitting in the front row with expressions of pride and amazement that still seemed slightly surreal. They had learned to talk about my work with genuine interest and respect, but I could see in their faces that they were still adjusting to the reality of who their daughter and sister had turned out to be. During my acceptance speech, I talked about the invisible nature of cybersecurity work, how the most important victories are the disasters that never happen, the attacks that are prevented, the systems that continue to function normally because dedicated professionals work around the clock to protect them. I talked about the honor of serving something larger than yourself, of measuring success not in personal recognition, but in the safety and security of the people you've sworn to protect. But mostly, I talked about the importance of seeing people clearly, of not letting assumptions and preconceptions prevent you from understanding the full reality of someone's life and contributions. I talked about how easy it is to overlook significance when it doesn't match your expectations, and how much we lose when we fail to recognize the achievements of the people closest to us. The applause that followed was polite and professional, but when I looked out at the audience, I saw my mother wiping tears from her eyes. For the first time in my life, she was seeing me not as the daughter who had disappointed her expectations, but as the person I had actually become despite those expectations. After the ceremony, as we gathered for the reception, Marcus approached me with the kind of tentative respect that suggested he was still learning how to relate to me as an adult, whose achievements exceeded his own. "Valentina, I owe you an apology that goes back many years," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "I spent so much time focused on what I thought success looked like that I completely missed the real success that was happening right in front of me. You've built something more important and more lasting than anything I ever imagined." The words were meaningful because they represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of value and achievement. But they also highlighted the tragedy of how much time we had lost, how many years of relationship had been sacrificed to his narrow vision of what mattered in life. "I appreciate that," I said, "and I also hope you understand that I don't need your validation anymore. I spent too many years measuring my worth by your approval. I'm proud of the work I do because it matters to me and to the country I serve, not because it impresses my family." He nodded, perhaps understanding for the first time that true achievement creates its own validation, that genuine success doesn't require external validation to be meaningful. Today, I lead a team of cybersecurity analysts who work to protect the digital infrastructure that modern society depends on. Our work remains largely invisible to the public, appreciated mainly when it prevents disasters that most people will never know were even possible. My family relationships have evolved into something more honest and respectful, built on a foundation of mutual understanding rather than the assumptions and dismissals that characterized our interactions for so many years. We see each other regularly, and they ask thoughtful questions about my work, but I no longer need their interest to feel valued. The most important lesson I learned from that Christmas night when my two worlds collided is that you cannot wait for other people to recognize your worth. You have to build a life that has meaning and purpose independent of external validation. And you have to measure your success by standards that matter to you, rather than by the approval of people who may never understand what you've accomplished. Recognition, when it comes, can be gratifying and useful, but it cannot be the foundation of your self-worth because the people whose opinions most to you may never be capable of seeing you clearly. The work itself has to be enough. The contribution you make has to be its own reward. The knowledge that you have served something larger than yourself has to provide its own satisfaction. That Christmas dinner ended with Secret Service agents escorting me to meet with the President of the United States. But it began something more important, my final liberation from the need for my family's approval and my complete acceptance of the person I had chosen to become despite those expectations. The invisible work continues, the threats evolve, and the protection of our digital infrastructure requires constant vigilance and adaptation. But I do this work now with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who I am and what I contribute to the world, regardless of whether anyone else ever fully understands or appreciates it. In the end, that understanding is the only validation that truly matters. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.